Hi, it's Pastor Marleen Griffith-Stull coming to you finally with another episode of our Exodus Bible study. I had some technical difficulties at church, so you get the home view. But we're looking at chapters 21 through 24 today of Exodus, and it starts off right after the giving of the Ten Commandments, and then there are some other laws in chapter 20 as well. So I encourage you to read that as you know, especially the law concerning the altar. But then you'll notice 21 through 23 is a bunch of laws. It's not a really exciting thing to read. Um, there's some things that don't even make sense to us today. For instance, I hope that you aren't a slave owner, so I hope that those laws don't really have an impact on your daily life. But I do want to point out some of the things within them because some of them are um, areas that are still helpful for us to be thinking about and how it relates to us even today. And other than that, it's just helpful for you to understand how people lived during Moses' time. So I do encourage you to read through all of it. But when you look at chapter 21, you'll see a whole section on laws concerning slaves. But one of the things I want you to take notice of is that a slave is a slave for 6 years. And in the seventh year, they're supposed to be let free. The exception is if the slave declares loyalty to the master, his ear gets pierced, and he becomes the master's lifelong slave. It was never intended to be lifelong servitude in a bad position. So that's a really important one throughout that section. And then the next section talks about laws about violence. Unfortunately, violence certainly still happens today. So I do encourage you to read through and see some of the laws and how they pertain. Some of them you might be appalled at, but it's worth seeing what they had to say. But one of the areas that I think is ripe for discussion is verses 24 and 25. It actually starts in 23. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And we read it and we think this is very harsh, especially life for life, eye for eye. But it's really meant, and I want you to read it as um, a way of limiting the retribution so that if a life is taken, only one life can be taken for it. If you would accidentally or even intentionally knock out somebody's eye, you can only take an eye for that. You can't kill them for it. You can't take their life for it. So even though when we read it, it seems so harsh and so horrible, I want you to keep in mind that it kept the violence to a minimum. So you could only have to a certain degree, and you could only take what had been lost, nothing more. So I hope that helps you as you read through this. Laws concerning property. Property laws are still really important. I'm not sure how helpful it will be for you when a lot of the property is livestock. I mean, there's a few people with livestock around, but not too many people in Mechanicsburg have ox working for them at this point. Laws of restitution, a lot of those also have to do with livestock, but also that general sense there are still thieves among us. So there's some other things as we get into chapter 22 about things and money being stolen, which unfortunately still happens. But then there's social and religious laws, at least that's what my heading calls it. And one is about lending money and not charging interest, which of course we have veered from greatly over the years. So there's some interesting things about that. But one of the other really interesting things is in verse 22 or chapter 22, verse 21. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. So, making sure you don't take advantage of the most vulnerable. But of course, we all get a chuckle out of alien because as soon as we hear the word alien, we think little green guys from Mars or somewhere. Um, But the reality is, we still do technically use the term for foreigners, but to make sure that we're taking care of the foreigners that are living among us. And this one might not seem so important, but I think it's very important even in the United States as we talk about how do we deal with refugees, how do we deal with even undocumented people. Um, and not that we don't hold them accountable when they do something wrong. When you break the law, you break the law, and we need to worry about that as well. But we also don't oppress people just because they're foreigners. And we had a really long discussion about the situation in the Middle East. And unfortunately, that has led to a lot of oppression, both of foreigners and of their own people in many cases. So continue to keep the Middle East in your thoughts and prayers. They continue to need those deep prayers. So you read through that section. I encourage you to read through all of the laws. And then chapter 23 talks about the first heading in my Bible is justice for all. So, it talks about trying to that fairness and justice for people and even for animals in one sense. And then the Sabbath time, which, we all know we're supposed to take a day off. We don't do it, especially as Americans. We don't buy into the idea that we should take a whole day off. We feel like we're lazy or we're not connected enough. We're not communicating well enough if we don't answer our phones for a whole day. And some of our jobs will be fired if people don't get a response for a whole day. But it is important to take some Sabbath time and to find a way to do that. And one of the interesting things, though, when you read through it's chapter 23 at this point, verses 10 through 12, you hear that it's much more than just taking a day of rest. It's letting your animals have a day. It's letting slaves have a day of rest. Or in our modern world, it's making sure workers have a day of rest. Um, so I think it's a more inclusive understanding, and even having the fields have a year of rest. 6 years of planting in the field and a seventh year of leaving it fallow. And we rotate crops sometimes now, or we do other things, but even in biblical times, I understood you can't just keep planting a crop over and over again in the same field and expecting it to do well. Even our land needs a rest of some sort. So you get that in this section, much fuller understanding of Sabbath. And then the annual festivals. And at that point, there's three festivals that they talk about. They talk about Passover, which if you haven't figured out is really important in Exodus. But then they also have two harvest festivals. One, kind of the first harvest, to celebrate the first grains. And then there's a harvest of ingathering right before winter comes, right before everything dies off. You make sure you get everything in for the winter, and it's kind of a second harvest time. And that's a time to celebrate right after that happens as well. So you read about that in chapter 23. And then you also read about this whole promise of the land of Canaan. And this is just one of those areas that I always struggle with. And if you've got some other thoughts on it, please share with me and help me understand it, because it's always hard for me to hear God telling people, go in and clear out the land. The people who live there um, are not the people who really own this land. And some of that is what's still happening in Israel today, not just Israel, but in Palestine and Israel and the whole Middle East. Um, so it's difficult for me. But one of the things that I hold on to is God promises that, this was your land, you will get it back. And not only will you get it back, there will be peace. And I will make sure there's peace between you and the other peoples. But to get to that, there is war and strife, as we know. And even in here, it does talk about that. So that is one of those biblical concepts that I continue to struggle with. And someday I will have resolution, but I'll never try to tell you I understand everything, because as soon as I do that, then I'm putting myself up with God. And um, we keep practicing our faith for a reason. You practice it because we can't fully understand God or God's ways, and we can't truly understand even God's word, not as finite humans, but we keep working at it. Now, when we get to chapter 24, we actually get back to the story again. You got all these laws, these last couple of chapters, and you get right back to the story. So we have Moses and Aaron, and we're ready to finally go up the mountain. So the people, before Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, they know the laws. They know the 10 words, which are the most important, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and they also know all these other laws. So Moses comes before them, and Aaron's there, and this um, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders are kind of there in front of the people. And they talk to the people and they tell them, you've heard all of God's words. Now you need to promise to do them. And I'm looking for the verse here where the people respond. Verse 7, we hear a response in chapter 24. Then he took the book of the covenant, meaning Moses, took the book of the covenant, which is what has all these laws written in it, and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, see, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. This is the first time this is not a one-way covenant. The other covenants, which we talked about last year during Lent, you always had God saying, I will do this, you are my people, and any harm was on God. So even in Genesis 15, where you have that weird story of the animals being cut in half and God's spirit kind of walking through them, the light walking through them, it's always God saying, if I break my promise, I will be like those animals and and be sacrificed, be killed, be gone. Um, but here, the blood of the covenant is on the people. So the people are told that if you're not responding, you will suffer, and even unto death. So this is a new phase in the relationship between the people of God and God. And then we get to this whole story, the real story of Sinai after that. And you get this really strange passage that, quite honestly, until I was studying this closely, I never paid much attention to. But I really encourage you to read verses 9 through 11 closely in chapter 24, because you have Moses and these other three, the Aaron, Nabda, and Abihu, and the 70 elders are all together. And God comes into their midst and eats with them and celebrates this covenant. Now, it seems completely contrary to other parts where we only have Moses in the presence of God. And they're actually dining with God. I mean, there's food and they're celebrating. So, my guess is, and other biblical scholars who know more Hebrew than myself also agree with this, by the way, that this is from another tradition, um, that there was not only the tradition of only Moses ever going in the presence of God, but there was another tradition where, at least at a little more of a distance, the other people were also in the presence of God. But what it results in is the early Hebrews said, we don't want to lose either one. We don't want to lose this tradition of Moses being called up and having this special relationship with God. That's really important. Moses is the lawgiver, and we need to make sure he's set apart from the larger group. But they also didn't want to lose this story of God's intimacy, God's um, uh, eminency with people, and with not just Moses, but with God's people, with the leaders of God's people. Um, and the sense of celebration over a meal, which we carry on into Holy Communion and other times that we have holy meals. But Holy Communion for us is the primary one, and especially because we're celebrating the covenant. So I encourage you to read through that a little closer if you want to talk about it. We had a good discussion during the Bible study, but feel free anytime to reach out. But then there is also a calling for Moses to go up closer to God even after this experience. So Moses goes up closer. Aaron is left in charge of the people of God. And we know how that goes. If you don't know, watch the movie The Ten Commandments or read the rest of Exodus. But we know it does not go well. But Moses also takes Joshua farther up on the mountain with him. And Joshua, of course, becomes the leader after Moses dies. Now, he apparently doesn't go the whole way up into the presence of God to receive the tablets, because this is what Moses is going up for, is to receive the tablets of stone. But he does go up a little bit farther than the other leaders as a servant of Moses. And then what happens when Moses gets on top of that mountain is why the people get a little concerned. And we always have a tendency to kind of judge the people of Israel. Okay, Moses goes up on a mountain to get the Ten Commandments. You know what the law is, and you break it right away, and you don't trust in God anymore, and you start worshiping the golden calf. But I want you to read closely those last few verses of this chapter to understand maybe why the people weren't sure that Moses was coming back down. Because there's this devouring fire on top of the mountain after Moses is up there. There's the clouds around, and then there's a devouring fire. And even after this devouring fire, it is 40 days total that Moses is up on top of the mountain. That's a long time, and if you've already seen a devouring fire, you may in fact believe that Moses is no longer alive. And that's the question for the Israelites later. All right, I will see you again later for another time together, but I pray that you would ponder what it means to truly be in the presence of God and how it is that we might be better followers of God's words and ways for us. God bless. Bye bye.